Hello everyone, before I start my story, I'd be very happy if you like the video and subscribe to my channel to support me. This is very important to me. Now, without dragging it out any longer, I'm starting right away. Hello, my name is Brandon. I'm 26 years old and I live in Chicago. I make a living riding a motorcycle, delivering food from restaurants to homes, racing against the cold and against time. From the outside, being a courier might seem like a simple, ordinary job, just picking up food from one address and delivering it to another. But the truth is, it's not as simple as it looks. We don't just carry food, we also carry people's urgency, impatience, and the never-ending stress of the city on our backs. In the middle of the night, while everyone is asleep in their warm beds, we chase our livelihood through those dark streets, getting hit by the freezing wind. The place I worked at was on the Lincoln Park side, a large pizza and burger shop with a very busy pace, open until late at night. The incident happened around the middle of December. Chicago's famous, razor-sharp cold had completely taken over the streets. Even though I was wearing my winter gear, thermal layers, a windproof jacket, and thick gloves as a precaution, every second I spent on the motorcycle made me feel the cold down to my bones. There was only 1 hour left until the end of my shift. The activity in the shop had slowed down, and the cooks had started cleaning up the kitchen. I was standing next to my motorcycle, trying to warm my hands a little by holding them close to the exhaust pipe. Kevin, the head of the packaging section, appeared at the door holding a plastic bag and a receipt. "Brandon, this is the last order, champ. It's going to the South Heights area. You can head straight home after dropping this off. No need to come back to the shop," he said. I took the bag from his hand and looked at the receipt. It was a simple order consisting of 2 pizzas and a cola. The address described one of the narrow streets in the upper parts of South Heights, where very old buildings were located. I placed the order into the thermal bag on the back of my motorcycle. Because of the cold and for safety, I put on my helmet, fastened the strap, and started the engine. At this hour, the roads were almost completely empty. The crowded streets that were impossible to walk through during the day gave way to a deep silence at night. Only occasionally did taxis and garbage trucks speed past me. I drove through downtown, then onto Wacker Drive, and from there toward the steep hills of South Heights. As I climbed the hills, I could feel the air getting even colder. My helmet visor kept fogging up, and I had to wipe it with my hand from time to time. It wasn't very hard to find the street written on the receipt. However, the street was very narrow, steep, and dark. Most of the streetlights were not working. The ones that were on didn't really illuminate the surroundings. They only cast a faint, orange light around themselves. The buildings were very close to each other, and all of them were at least 40 to 50 years old, worn out and with peeling paint. I moved slowly, checking the apartment numbers at the entrances of the buildings. Finally, near the end of the street, I stopped in front of an apartment building that looked much gloomier and more unsettling than the others. Its exterior had darkened over time. Most of its windows were unlit, and it was buried in silence. I carefully parked my motorcycle by the sidewalk, making sure it wouldn't slip on the sloped road. I opened the storage box, took out the pizza bag, and walked toward the building's iron door. The glass of the door was broken, and a thick piece of cardboard had been taped over it. When I pushed the iron door, a heavy metal scraping sound broke the silence of the street. The moment I stepped inside, a disgusting, rotten smell of the old building filled my nose. I waited for the automatic light to turn on, but everything remained pitch dark. The sensor was broken, or the fuse had been turned off. I felt around the wall and found the switch, then pressed it. The stairwell lit up with a dim, yellowish light. The order was from the 4th floor. The ceilings of the building were very high, and the stairs looked quite steep. The elevator was old and didn't look very safe. But at that hour of the night, with all the exhaustion of the day on me, I didn't want to climb those steep stairs up to the 4th floor. I headed toward the elevator standing right across from the entrance. It was the kind commonly found in old Chicago buildings. I pressed the call button. Mechanical sounds came from above, the sound of cables tightening. It took quite a while for the elevator to come down. Slowly, shaking, it reached the ground floor and stopped. I grabbed the handle of the iron door and pulled it toward me. The cabin was very small. If two people stood side by side, their shoulders would touch. Its light was even dimmer than the hallway light and flickered constantly. On the back wall of the cabin, there was a large mirror. Its edges rusted and darkened over time, with black stains in the middle. I pressed the button for the 4th floor on the control panel. Then I pulled the folding door shut. The elevator started moving upward with a slight jolt. As it ascended, the friction sounds coming from the walls echoed inside the cabin. I hadn't taken off my helmet. I had only lifted the visor. I stood with my back against the elevator door, exhausted, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The weight of the day and all its stress had piled onto my shoulders. I just wanted to deliver this order, go home, take a hot shower and sleep. The elevator passed the 1st floor. As I stared at myself in the mirror, my eyes drifted off. Right when we reached the 2nd floor, the cabin suddenly slowed down and stopped with a jolt. I paused. I looked at the panel to check if I had accidentally pressed another button, but only the 4th floor light was on. I hadn't pressed anything. Someone on the 2nd floor must have called the elevator. Before I could even understand what was happening, the elevator door opened slowly with a strained sound. Out of reflex, I stepped aside to make room. My eyes were still on the mirror in front of me. As the door opened, a man stepped into the cabin. He was of medium height, wearing an old, worn-out brown jacket with broad shoulders. He had a flat cap on his head, and his face couldn't be clearly seen due to the shadow of the cap and the weak light of the elevator. I could only make out his jawline and the deep lines at the corners of his lips. As soon as he entered, he moved to my right, toward the corner of the mirror. I could see him clearly in the reflection. His presence felt so real, so physical, that I didn't doubt it for even a second. In the mirror, he turned toward me and slightly bowed his head in greeting. Not a single word came out of his mouth. It was just a silent, ordinary nod. Exhausted from the whole day and not wanting to get into unnecessary conversations with strangers, I didn't say anything. I simply nodded back slightly, responding to his greeting through the mirror. As the folding door closed, I saw him put his hands into the pockets of his jacket. The elevator jerked again and started moving upward. There were 2 of us in that narrow cabin. The silence was starting to become uncomfortable. I wanted to see which floor the man would get off on, whether he had pressed another button on the panel. Maybe he had forgotten to press it. I turned my head slightly to the right, toward where the man was standing, to ask him which floor he was going to. I parted my lips, about to speak, but the words I was about to say got stuck in my throat like a stone. The inside of the elevator was completely empty. The man who had been standing to my right, who had entered just seconds ago, who had looked at me through the mirror and nodded, he was not there. How was that possible? The man was gone. I was inside a narrow cabin with no place to escape, its door closed and in motion, and the man who had been standing right next to me had physically disappeared. There is no word to describe what I felt in that moment. My entire body went completely rigid. In shock and fear, I felt my blood freezing in my veins, my heart pounding violently as if it would tear through my ribcage and burst out. I couldn't breathe. The air I took in wouldn't go down my throat. My eyes were wide open, staring into nothing. I immediately turned my head back to the mirror. In the reflection, I could only see my own face, pale with terror, filled with horror. I looked at the corners of the cabin, the ceiling, the floor. There was nothing. The door had definitely not opened. The elevator had not stopped. We were moving. My lips trembled in fear, and parted involuntarily. "Oh my God," I whispered. Even to my own ears, my voice sounded unfamiliar, cracked, and weak. Seconds began to feel like hours. When I felt that mechanical jolt indicating the elevator had passed the 3rd floor, my mind struggled to place what I had seen onto something logical. The exhaustion of the day, the lack of sleep, the cold air, maybe it was just an illusion. It was impossible to make sense of it, but my mind kept trying to explain it. The stains on the mirror, the weak light, maybe they had tricked my brain. That's what I wanted to believe. But I had felt him open the folding door when he entered the elevator. That physical strain, I had seen it. I kept telling myself that I was hallucinating from exhaustion. Cold sweat was running down my back. The inside of my helmet had suddenly turned into a sauna. My breath was hitting the visor and bouncing back, making me feel like I was suffocating. Finally, the elevator jerked and stopped at the 4th floor. I pushed the iron door open and threw myself outside, taking a deep breath. Even the air of the building felt cleaner than that narrow cabin. The automatic light wasn't on. The light I had turned on at the ground floor didn't reach here, and the stairwell was buried in deep darkness. I took off my helmet and put my motorcycle key in my pocket. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and lit up the surroundings. There were 2 apartments facing each other on the 4th floor. The one on the right had a newer steel door. The one on the left was old, wooden, with peeling paint, and had a tarnished brass nameplate on it. I held the receipt under the phone's light and checked again. Apartment 9. I looked at the number on the wooden door. It said 9. This was the place. I gripped the pizza bag tightly. A voice inside me was telling me to leave the package at the door and get out of there immediately. The effect of what I had experienced in the elevator was still on me. There was a tightness in my stomach that I couldn't explain. Still, I didn't want to leave my job unfinished. After all, the man had ordered and he would pay for it. I pressed the doorbell next to the door. An old-fashioned, melodic chime came from inside. I waited. The building was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I waited for about a minute. No one opened the door. I thought maybe they had fallen asleep at this hour of the night. I pressed the bell again, this time holding it a bit longer. Again, there was no response other than the echoing bell inside. I took out my phone to call the customer. I dialed the number on the receipt. But when I looked at the screen, I saw that there was no signal at all. The phone had no service. Because the walls of these old buildings were very thick, problems like this could happen sometimes. I took a few steps toward the stairwell to find a signal. But it was useless. The phone had no signal at all. I returned to the door. This time, I knocked on the wooden door a few times with my hand. "Food delivery," I called out. My voice echoed in the stairwell. Then that heavy silence fell again. I was just about to hang the package on the door handle and leave when I heard a sound from inside. It was crying. I froze where I stood. I leaned my ear closer to the door. Yes, there was definitely a crying sound coming from inside. But this was not ordinary crying. It was a chilling, deep, continuous sobbing. I couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. It sounded like a muffled groan filled with intense pain and desperation. The sound was coming directly from behind the door, from very close. Someone was standing right behind the door, crying without opening it. "Are you okay?" I asked instinctively. There was a tremor and fear in my voice that I was trying to hide. "I brought your order." No response came. The crying didn't decrease or increase. It continued at the same monotone, the same disturbing tone. I looked at the gap under the door. There was no light inside. The presence of someone standing right behind the door in a pitch-black house at 2 in the morning, sobbing uncontrollably, completely shattered my nerves. After what I had experienced in the elevator, This situation only made the fear inside me grow even more. I hesitated whether to reach for the door handle or not. Maybe someone inside needed help. Maybe they were having a medical emergency. But my instincts were screaming at me to leave immediately. There was something in that crying that was not human, something deeply disturbing and cold. This sound was different. My blood had run cold. My hair stood on end. The more I listened, the worse it became. I felt a heavy weight settling on my shoulders. "Look, I'm leaving the package at the door," I said, raising my voice slightly. This time, the words rushed out of my mouth. I hooked the bag onto the door handle and placed the receipt inside the bag. I took a step back. The crying continued. I turned toward the elevator to press the call button. But the thought of that slow elevator, of stepping back into that dark cabin, terrified me. My eyes shifted to the stairs. I shone my phone's light into the stairwell. Walking down 4 floors felt much safer than waiting inside that enclosed box again. I headed toward the stairs with quick steps. As I descended the first steps, I struggled not to look back. As I moved away from the 4th floor landing, that muffled crying slowly faded behind me. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was out of breath, but I didn't stop. As I descended to the 2nd floor, even the echo of my own footsteps in the stairwell frightened me. It felt as if someone was coming down the stairs behind me at the same time, following me. When I reached the ground floor, I ran toward the building's main door. I grabbed the handle and threw myself outside, into the freezing Chicago cold. As the cold air filled my lungs, I felt myself come back to my senses a little. The street was still as silent and deserted as I had left it. My motorcycle was standing by the sidewalk under the faint light of the street lamp. I walked straight toward it. Before putting on my helmet, I took another deep breath. I was only then realizing how much my entire body ached from the tension. My hands were trembling. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The dashboard lit up. Just as I was about to put on my helmet, I instinctively lifted my head and looked up at the 4th floor of that dark building, at the windows of the apartment where I had left the order. There was no light in the windows. The weak orange glow of the street lamp couldn't fully reach that height. Only a faint reflection showed on the glass. In that pitch darkness, right behind the window, there were 2 people standing side by side. For a moment, I wanted to believe my eyes were playing tricks on me, that out of exhaustion, I was mistaking shadows for people. I blinked and looked again carefully. No, I wasn't mistaken. There were 2 figures. One was slightly taller, with broad shoulders. The other was a smaller silhouette standing right next to it. Both of them were standing right behind the glass, inside that pitch-dark room, looking directly down at me. There was no movement. No waving, no knocking on the glass, not even the slightest motion. They were just standing there, watching me like lifeless mannequins. It was impossible to make out their facial features. But even from that distance, I could feel the weight of their gaze, the coldness of it on my skin. Knowing that the man who had appeared beside me in the elevator and the one who had been sobbing behind the door were now watching me from behind that window froze my blood completely. My brain was screaming danger, and my instincts were telling me to get out of there immediately. I forced my eyes away from those 2 figures. My hands trembling, I put on my helmet. Without even fastening the strap, I quickly pulled down the visor. I put the motorcycle into gear and twisted the throttle all the way. I don't remember how I got out of that street, how I left those dark and narrow roads behind. In that freezing night, as the wind slipped through the edges of my visor and cut into my face, the only thing I could think about was those eyes. The entire way, I didn't even dare to look at the rearview mirrors out of fear. I was so afraid of seeing that man in the brown jacket sitting behind me on the motorcycle seat, looking at me through the mirror, that I didn't take my eyes off the road for even a second. When I got home, I don't even know how I parked the motorcycle in the apartment yard, or how I ran up the stairs 2 or 3 steps at a time. As soon as I opened the door and got inside, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. After hearing the lock click 3 times in a row, I leaned my back against the door and collapsed onto the floor. I was gasping for air. The house was warm, but I still couldn't calm down. I was trembling. I threw my jacket and helmet into the middle of the living room. I turned on all the lights. I turned on the TV and raised the volume. I was terrified of the silence, especially of any sound that might come from behind doors. That night, I couldn't sleep until morning. Every time I closed my eyes, what I had seen came back in front of me. I sat on the couch with my knees pulled up to my chest, reciting every prayer I knew over and over again. That deep, continuous crying sound coming from behind the wooden door kept echoing in my ears. My mind was searching for a logical explanation for what I had experienced, but it couldn't find one. Every time, it shattered against the image of those 2 motionless silhouettes in that dark window. The next day, around noon, I went to work. Dark circles had formed under my eyes from lack of sleep, and my face was pale as chalk. The shop was as busy as always. Pizzas were being prepared, steaming hot. Frank, the owner, was at the register. When he saw me, he frowned. "What's wrong, son? Are you sick? You look really pale," he said. "I think I caught a cold, brother." I brushed it off. My eyes searched for Kevin in the packaging section. I found him by the oven, preparing orders. I walked up to him, making sure my voice wouldn't tremble. "Kevin, I want to ask you something. You know that last delivery you gave me last night, the one going to South Heights, who placed that order?" Kevin put down the tongs in his hand and turned to me. "Which order, champ?" "Oh, the one to the 4th floor. What happened? Did they underpay you?" "No," I said, swallowing. "Was the order placed through the app, or did they call?" Kevin thought for a moment, then walked toward the computer by the register. "They called Brandon. I was the one who picked up the phone. It was an elderly man." "What?" His voice sounded a bit muffled. I had a hard time understanding the address. He said 2 pizzas and a cola. He said he'd pay cash at the door, then hung up. "Did something go wrong?" "No, nothing went wrong," I said. "I just had a bit of trouble finding the address. I got curious." I walked away from him. So someone really had placed the order. An elderly man on the phone. The deep fear inside me began to turn into a strange curiosity. I couldn't stop thinking about that order anymore. I had to go back to that street in daylight and see that building again. I needed to be sure whether my mind had been playing tricks on me in the darkness of the night. I grabbed the motorcycle key and left the shop. It was around 3 in the afternoon. The weather was cloudy and cold, but at least it wasn't dark. This time, I rode up the steep hills of South Heights in daylight. The narrow street that had terrified me at night now just looked like an old, neglected Chicago street. There were cars parked along the road, a few kids returning from school. I moved toward the end of the street and found the building. In daylight, it looked even more worn out and dilapidated. The exterior paint was completely cracked, and the balcony railings were covered in rust. I parked the motorcycle where I had left it the night before. Right across the building, at the corner of the street, there was a small, old convenience store. Its window had faded newspaper clippings and advertisement stickers. I went inside. It was warm from a stove inside, and there was a faint smell of tea and biscuits. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with graying hair, wearing a thick sweater. "Good day, sir," I said. "Thanks, son, welcome," he replied, standing up. I bought a bottle of water. As I handed him the money, I nodded toward the building across the street. Sir, I want to ask you something. Do you know who lives in apartment 9 on the 4th floor of that building? The man paused as he handed me the change. He narrowed his eyes and looked at me. Then he turned his gaze toward the building. What's going on, son? Why are you asking about number 9? Who are you? I'm a courier, sir. I delivered food to that apartment last night. I rang the bell, no one opened, so I left the package at the door and left. I just thought I'd ask while passing by in daylight. Maybe they wrote the wrong address or something. The expression on the man's face suddenly changed. He placed the coins in his hand on the counter. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. What are you talking about, son? Are you making fun of me? His voice had become serious and a bit harsh. No, sir, not at all. It was around 2 in the morning. I delivered the order. 4th floor, number 9, a wooden door. The shopkeeper took a deep breath, pulled out a stool from under the counter and sat down. He gestured to the chair in front of him. Sit down, he said. I sat down, curious. Listen, son, he began. His voice was now lower and more cautious. I've been the grocer of this street for 30 years. I know that building from its foundation. That apartment you're talking about on the 4th floor has been empty for at least 15 years. There are locks upon locks on its door. No one goes in or out of that place. As he spoke, I felt a drop of cold sweat run down my back. What do you mean, sir? It's impossible for it to be empty. That empty apartment placed an order. I went all the way to the door. From inside, I said. I couldn't finish my sentence. I didn't want to mention the crying. From inside what? The man asked, staring directly into my eyes. Nothing, I said, swallowing. Who used to live there? The man shook his head slowly. He turned his eyes back toward the building. There used to be a man named Miller living there. He lived with his daughter. Old man Miller was a quiet, harmless man. Summer or winter, he never took off his flat cap or that old brown jacket. His daughter, the poor girl, was well. Doctors couldn't find a cure. The old folks around here used to say she was possessed by an evil spiritual entity. Strange noises and crying fits would constantly come from that house. The whole building would wake up to the girl's screams in the middle of the night. Old man Miller tried everything. He had many rituals performed, but it didn't help. The girl wasted away day by day and eventually died in that house. I held my breath listening to him. The man in the elevator with the flat cap and brown jacket. That endless, sobbing crying behind the door. Everything was coming together in my mind like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. What happened next? I asked, my voice barely audible. Old man Miller couldn't handle his daughter's death. He lost his mind. And after a while, we lost him too. Since that day, that apartment door has never been opened. People in the building don't consider that floor safe anyway. No one goes up to the 4th floor unless absolutely necessary. It's impossible for you to have delivered an order there last night, son. Maybe someone played a bad joke on you. I don't know, sir, I said as I slowly stood up. My legs were trembling. Maybe I went to the wrong apartment. Thanks for the information. When I stepped out of the shop, my head was spinning. My steps unconsciously led me toward the entrance of that old building. It was daytime. I knew I was safe, but that dark feeling inside me wouldn't go away. I pushed the iron door and stepped inside. Even in daylight, the stairwell maintained its gloomy atmosphere. Trying not to look at the elevator, I moved toward the stairs. I started climbing slowly, step by step, my heart pounding against my chest. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. And finally, the fourth floor. The darkness from last night was gone. I looked at the door handle. The white plastic bag, the one I had hung there with my own hands the night before, containing 2 pizzas and a cola, was not there. I looked at the bottom of the door frame. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust. There was a buildup of dust on the doorbell and the handle, showing that no one but me had touched them. But the bag I had hung there was gone. I looked around. The stairs in front of the apartment on the right. It was nowhere. At that moment, I fully realized that there are realities in this world that we cannot explain, that we cannot define the boundaries of. The voice that placed that order, the man in the flat cap who came up in the elevator with me and silently greeted me through the mirror, the girl crying endlessly behind that door in unbearable pain. They were there, trapped in a loop within their own time, their own dimension. And for a brief moment, I had stepped into that loop. I slowly took a step back. Then I turned around and walked quickly down the stairs. I don't remember how I got out of that building or how I got back on my motorcycle. I never passed through that street in South Heights again. Time passed. I quit my courier job. I started working in a factory. That incident affected me deeply. Now I'm afraid to go out at night, afraid to even take an elevator. Sometimes when the night is very quiet, I hear that muffled, endless crying from far away. And I know this. Even if some doors appear closed, what's behind them is still waiting for us to open them. That was the story, brothers. Take good care of yourselves, and don't forget to support us like,